All right, get ready, folks, because today we are diving deep
Deep?
into a scenario that's got everybody talking.
Oh, yeah.
The return of Trump.
Wow.
A second term in the White House. Can you believe it? We've got two really interesting articles to help us unpack this. One from the East African and one from Al Jazeera.
Okay.
So picture this. You wake up on November 6th, 2024, and Donald Trump has defied all the odds and beaten Kamala Harris in the U.S. presidential election.
A real shocker.
A comeback story for the ages.
It really makes you think, a lot of people thought that after January 6th and all those indictments,
Yeah.
that was it for him, politically speaking. But, well,
Here we are.
here we are.
I mean, what led to this? The economy seemed pretty strong under Biden and Harris.
Yeah, you're right. The stock market was soaring. Unemployment was down. But it seems like that wasn't the reality for a lot of Americans.
Yeah.
Both articles point to this economic anxiety, especially about inflation, as a major factor in Trump's win.
Right.
And, you see these shifts. It's
Yeah.
like Hispanic voters and lower income households moving towards Trump.
Pretty surprising.
It is. It really highlights how complicated this whole thing is, like how people actually feel about the economy versus the hard numbers.
And that's what I found so interesting about the East African article. They said job security was the top issue for voters.
Oh, wow.
But Biden and Harris had those low unemployment numbers, so why were people so worried about jobs?
Yeah, it's that disconnect, right, between what the data says and what people are actually experiencing. Think about it. If your paycheck isn't keeping up with how much everything costs,
Right.
even if you have a job,
Yeah.
you're still feeling squeezed.
Yeah.
So it's more about affordability than just having a job.
Yeah.
You know?
Right, right.
And then you add in things like fear of automation, globalization, those anxieties that Trump really tapped into.
Yeah.
He positioned himself as the protector of American jobs, even though those global forces are way more complicated.
So even if you technically have a job, if you can't afford basic things like food or gas.
Exactly.
That anxiety trumps,
No pun intended. Any good news about the stock market?
Yeah, and Trump, with his populist rhetoric, he was really good at channeling that frustration, blaming Biden and Harris for problems that were often global, offering simple solutions to very complex problems.
Yeah.
And it resonated with voters who wanted change, any kind of change.
Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at how the world reacted to Trump's victory. Al Jazeera really captured the whole spectrum of responses, from cautious optimism to outright celebration,
Oh, wow.
and some skepticism thrown in there too.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It
Right.
really shows you how many different anxieties and interests are out there.
Right.
Some see Trump's return as a good thing,
Yeah.
others are worried, and some are just trying to figure out what it all means for them.
Exactly.
Like Netanyahu, he was over the moon,
Yeah.
calling it the greatest comeback and talking about a new beginning for the U.S.-Israel alliance. Seems like he's hoping to strengthen that relationship even more with Trump back in charge. Now, that's a pretty stark contrast to the Taliban's response. They're hoping for a new chapter in U.S.-Afghan relations.
Oh, interesting.
Given their history, it's hard to imagine what that would actually look like.
Yeah, especially after that chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan under Biden.
Right.
But their statement, even though it's vague,
Yeah.
suggests they want better relations with the U.S. Maybe they see Trump's America First approach as a chance for them to have more autonomy. Who knows if it'll actually lead to any real policy changes, though. We'll have to wait and see.
And then there's Russia. Putin's spokesperson basically dismissed the U.S. as an unfriendly country. And Medvedev had this backhanded compliment saying that at least Trump doesn't like stupid hanger-on allies.
Oh, wow.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's kind of like they're downplaying the whole thing publicly.
Yeah, right.
But, they're analyzing everything behind the scenes, figuring out how this might benefit them. Remember, Trump's relationship with Putin has always been a bit of a mystery.
Yeah.
It'll definitely be a focal point now that he's back.
So we've got some world leaders welcoming Trump back, while others are definitely approaching this new reality with caution,
Yeah,
maybe even a little bit of fear.
it's understandable.
But let's bring it back home to the U.S. The East African article talked about Trump's promises to reshape the executive branch,
Oh, yeah.
even suggesting he might fire civil servants he sees as disloyal.
Hmm.
It's a little unsettling, isn't it?
It does raise some concerns, about
Yeah.
increased polarization and potential instability in the government.
Right.
Remember his first term, lots of turnover, clashes with officials, and now
Yeah.
There's this worry that he might try to consolidate power, surround himself with loyalists instead of experienced people.
And we can't forget about the concerns that he might use federal agencies for his own political agenda.
Absolutely.
He hasn't always been the biggest fan of democratic norms and the rule of law.
You said it.
Makes you wonder if he'll just double down on that approach now.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. The article even suggests that personal loyalty might be more important than experience to him when making appointments, which could lead to a less experienced and potentially less stable government.
Right, right.
And that raises a big question. Can American democracy handle another 4 years of Trump's, let's say, unique leadership style?
It's a thought-provoking question.
It is. It really is.
Okay, so we've got this mix of economic anxieties, global uncertainty, and a whole lot of questions about what Trump's second term will actually look like.
It's a lot to take in.
But let's focus on one specific thing that's raising eyebrows, this idea of executive overreach.
Right. Both articles touched on that.
Basically, when a president oversteps their boundaries, you know?
Yeah, it's when they go beyond what the Constitution allows.
Right.
And potentially interfere with the other branches of government.
So can you give us an example of what that might look like in practice?
Imagine Trump trying to bypass Congress and implement policies through executive orders. Even if those orders are legally questionable, or if he tries to control independent agencies,
Right.
taking away their autonomy.
It's starting to sound a bit like what some people are calling authoritarian.
Yeah, that term gets thrown around a lot.
But what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, authoritarianism is basically a system where you have a strong central power, one person in control, and limited freedom for everyone else. Now, the U.S. has this long history of democratic principles and checks and balances.
Right.
But some people worry that Trump's actions, like ignoring norms and concentrating power, could weaken those safeguards. It's not about saying he's an authoritarian leader,
Right.
but recognizing that some of his actions kind of align with that style of governing.
It's a chilling thought.
It is.
And the Al Jazeera article picked up on that, too, talking about how worried people are about the future of American democracy under Trump.
And those concerns are valid. You know,
Yeah.
democratic values don't disappear overnight. It's a slow process that often starts with small compromises. So it's really important to stay vigilant and hold our leaders accountable, no matter who they are.
So we've got economic factors, global anxieties, potential threats to democracy.
It's a lot.
It is. But I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah, it's all connected.
And this is just the beginning of our deep dive.
Right.
We've barely scratched the surface of this complex issue.
There's so much more to explore.
Exactly. As we go deeper, we'll look at how Trump's return might affect specific policies, different groups in society, and most importantly, how we can all navigate this uncertain political landscape.
It'll be a fascinating journey.
It will.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so Trump is back in the White House, and with that comes a whole lot of uncertainty and, honestly, potential for some serious shakeups. Let's dig into some specific areas where we might see the biggest changes, starting with trade. The East African article hinted that Trump's America First policies might cause some friction, not just with China, but even with U.S. allies. Could we be looking at another global trade war?
It's definitely possible. You know, during his first term, he wasn't afraid to slap tariffs on goods from China to the EU, even close allies like Canada and Mexico.
Right, he was all about protecting American jobs and industries.
Exactly. But a lot of people argue that it ended up hurting American consumers and businesses in the long run.
So it's kind of a lose-lose situation then, trying to help one group but ending up hurting everyone in the process.
It can be. It's not that simple. And it's not just about the economics either. Trade wars can really damage relationships between countries and create global instability. It'll be interesting to see how Trump handles all of this in his second term. Will he stick with that protectionist approach or try to make new trade deals that benefit the U.S.?
Let's talk about the big one, the war in Ukraine. Trump's been kind of all over the place with his stance on that, and some people are worried he might pull back support for Ukraine. That would be a huge shift in U.S. policy.
Absolutely, and the consequences could be enormous.
Yeah.
On one hand, he's praised Putin's leadership, which makes you think he might soften the U.S. stance on Russia. But then he's also criticized European countries for not doing enough for NATO, for relying too much on the U.S.
So it's a tough one to predict.
It really is. It's going to be fascinating and a little nerve-wracking to see how he handles it.
So could this mean the U.S. steps back from its role as a global leader? Could we see a more isolationist approach under Trump?
It's not impossible. His America First agenda definitely puts domestic interests front and center. But we have to remember that foreign policy is complicated.
Sure.
It's not just about what one person wants. It's influenced by domestic politics, economics, all sorts of strategic considerations.
Mm.
So even as Trump leans towards isolationism, it doesn't mean the U.S. can just cut itself off from the rest of the world.
Right. We can't just pretend everything else is going on doesn't matter.
Exactly. There are treaties, alliances, a whole global system to think about.
Okay, so potential trade wars, uncertainty about Ukraine, a possible shift towards isolationism.
It's a lot.
It is, it is. But let's bring it back to the U.S. for a minute. The Al Jazeera article brought up some domestic issues that are likely to be big during Trump's second term, like immigration. It was a huge part of his first campaign, and it seems like it's going to be a top priority again. What kind of changes are we looking at?
Well, the article mentioned that he's promised to tighten immigration policies even more, potentially restarting the border wall construction and cracking down on undocumented immigrants. He's even talked about mass deportations.
That sounds pretty extreme. What impact could that have on immigrant communities, on the whole country, really?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's bound to be controversial. People who oppose these kinds of policies argue that they're inhumane, discriminatory, and that they hurt the economy.
Yeah.
They point out that undocumented immigrants contribute a lot to the U.S. economy and that mass deportations would tear families apart, create a lot of fear and instability.
And there's also the question of how Trump will actually govern.
Oh, right.
He's already talking about firing people he sees as disloyal, which is pretty worrying.
Definitely raises concerns about potential abuses of power.
It's almost like he wants to create his own reality, one where facts and evidence don't matter as much as loyalty and obedience.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And that kind of thinking can really erode trust in institutions, which weakens the very foundation of democracy.
Right.
If he surrounds himself with people who won't question him or give him honest advice, it creates this echo chamber where bad decisions can happen without any checks.
So we're potentially looking at a scenario where the executive branch gains more and more power while Congress and the judiciary are weakened.
It's a concern that a lot of experts have. They point to Trump's disregard for norms and precedents, his attacks on the media, and how he tried to interfere with the justice system as red flags.
So it's not just about specific policies, but about a pattern of behavior that suggests he might not respect the checks and balances that are so important to American democracy.
Exactly. And that's what makes this situation so fragile. It's not just about whether you agree with Trump's policies or not. It's about the potential for long-term damage to the very system that underpins American democracy.
So you've talked about the global reaction, the economic worries, the social and cultural anxieties. But what does this all really mean for, the average American? And maybe even more importantly, what does it mean for American democracy itself?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've seen how divided the U.S. has become, and this election, like the East African article pointed out, seems to have made it even worse. It's like the country's on edge, and with Trump back in charge, well, it's hard not to worry about what's next.
Yeah, it feels like the country is being pulled in two completely opposite directions. With Trump back in the White House, it's hard not to worry about what that means for democracy, Are we at some kind of tipping point?
I can understand those concerns, definitely. Remember, Trump's first term was, well, let's say he didn't always play by the rules. He attacked the media constantly, made people doubt the election process, and even, well, we all saw what happened on January 6th.
It's pretty scary to think about. And the Al Jazeera article had a lot of people, both in the U.S. and around the world, saying they're really worried about the U.S. becoming more authoritarian under Trump.
It's a valid concern, for sure. Democratic values don't just vanish overnight. It's a gradual process, starting with what might seem like small compromises at first.
Right.
It's like a slow leak in a boat. You might not notice it at first, but eventually it can sink the whole thing.
So what can everyday Americans do to protect democracy, especially now? How do we plug those leaks, so to speak?
Well, first things first, stay informed, stay engaged. I know it sounds simple, but it's crucial.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed with all the news and information out there, but we have to stay up to date and hold our leaders accountable.
I get that, but it can feel like a huge task, especially when things look so bleak. Where do you even begin?
You're right, it can be overwhelming. But remember, you don't have to do everything at once. Start small. Find some reliable news sources that you trust, and focus on staying informed about the issues that are most important to you.
Okay, so be informed, but also talk to people, even those who might disagree with you.
Exactly. Democracy needs open and honest debate. And don't forget, there are so many organizations and people out there working hard to protect democratic values and encourage people to get involved.
Oh, that's good to hear. Can you give us some examples? I think our listeners would want to know where they can find support and get involved.
Absolutely. You've got groups like the ACLU and the League of Women Voters. They've been fighting for civil rights and democracy for decades. And there are newer organizations like Protect Democracy and the Brennan Center for Justice. They're specifically focused on protecting democracy from authoritarian threats.
So there are resources out there for people who want to make a difference.
Definitely. And remember, it doesn't have to be some grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes the most effective actions are the small, everyday ones.
Like what? Can you give us some examples? I think that would be really helpful.
Think of it this way. Democracy is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised to stay strong. So what are some everyday exercises you can do? Talk to your friends and family about these issues, attend a town hall meeting, volunteer for a local organization, donate to a cause you believe in. All those actions, even if they seem small, they all contribute to something bigger.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we can still make a difference.
Exactly. That's an important message right now. Trump's win might feel like a setback, but it's not the end of the story. The fight for democracy continues, and we all have a role to play.
It's not about being naive. It's about informed action and sticking to our values.
Well said.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've talked about so much, from the unexpected election results to the global reactions, the challenges here at home, and what it means to be an American at this point in history. We've talked about the anxieties, the uncertainties, but also the power we have as individuals and the importance of getting involved.
It's been fascinating and sometimes a bit unsettling, to be honest. But I think it's helped us understand just how complex and uncertain things are right now. And it's also reminded us that we all have a responsibility for the future of our country.
I completely agree. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the fight for democracy being an ongoing one. What's your final thought for our listeners as they navigate this new reality?
Don't underestimate the power you have. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Even when things feel tough, we can all make a difference. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for what you believe in. The future of American democracy depends on it.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope this has been informative and thought-provoking for you. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay engaged with the world around you. That's what the deep dive is all about.